Augustus was a tough emperor to follow. From age 19 until his death at age 75, he took on one of history's greatest renovation projects, reconstructing a ruined Roman Republic into a new imperial apparatus. Augustus was never called a king, but the Roman Senate awarded him a collection of titles and powers that, when combined together, ensured that he and he alone controlled the state as an autocrat. When he died in 14 AD, this personal state that he had fashioned for himself was passed on to a man, Augustus's adopted son Tiberius, who seemed unsure of whether he even wanted the prize. Tiberius was clearly not Augustus's first choice, only being adopted after Augustus's grandsons conveniently died, and Tiberius would only be in charge a few years before others began to question whether this new emperor was up to the job. Was Tiberius a reluctant Roman emperor? We'll talk about that and more on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 9, Tiberius Takes Over. The transition from Augustus to Tiberius was meant to look simple and straightforward. Augustus became sick in the Italian city of Nola, this is near the Bay of Naples, and Tiberius then rushed to his bedside, and just before he died, or maybe just after, the succession was reaffirmed. The next day, Augustus was dead, and Tiberius was emperor. No need to question it. And, of course, no historian doubts that Tiberius was the designated heir. But as I mentioned in the last episode, somebody, perhaps it was Tiberius, perhaps it was his mother, Livia, somebody, however, ordered the death of Augustus's last surviving grandson, Agrippa Posthumus, just to be sure there would be no rival claimants to power. There was another loose end as well, and that was Augustus's daughter, Julia. If you remember, she had been exiled after committing adultery, and Tiberius, who was unenthusiastic about being married to her in the first place, divorced her. When Augustus died in 14 AD, Julia was 52 years old, well past the age she could bear children, of no use whatsoever to the new regime. And so then Tiberius, or perhaps Livia, his mother, ordered Julia's income cut off, and whatever remained of her property was confiscated. And so this woman, the widow of Agrippa, the mother of Augustus's own grandchildren, she was plunged into sudden poverty. And it was just a matter of months before she ended up dying. We don't know how. I suspect she died of suicide, but there is no record of exactly what happened to her. Tiberius was 4 years older than Julia in 14 AD. He was 56 years old. And there was no official title of emperor as such to pass on. Instead, the variety of titles and powers that the Senate had voted to Augustus over the past few decades were offered to Tiberius. Some of those when Augustus died, and some of them had actually been given to him a few years earlier. So Tiberius would be called princeps, for example. That's the first in AD 12, a couple of years before Augustus died. But once Tiberius's adopted father passed away, then he also took on a new title, Son of the God, because the Senate immediately declared that Augustus, when he died, ascended into heaven to take his place among the gods. He was divine. But Tiberius did not accept all of the titles that Augustus had held. And this is a little bit curious. And at first, it probably looked to the Senate that this new emperor was following after Augustus, that he was pretending to be humble and refusing the honors, and then what they were supposed to do was to then offer them again. This way Tiberius wouldn't seem too eager to assume ultimate power. It looked like the kind of thing that Augustus did, a way of showing some respect and deference to the Senate. But then they kept offering, and Tiberius kept refusing over and over. And eventually the senators realized that Tiberius was serious senators started to become confused, and even some of them began to get angry. Tiberius, for example, would not take the title Father of the Country. This was a rare and prestigious honor. Only a few Republicans in the past century had been given that title, and it was held by both Julius Caesar and Augustus. It was strange that he refused it. Even more strange, Tiberius also refused the title of imperator, and this is the closest Latin cognate to the English word emperor. The Senate must have been even more perplexed at this refusal. Imperator meant commander, as in the commander of the Roman military. And if Tiberius wasn't in charge of the soldiers, well then who on earth was? Evidently, the soldiers were asking this same question when Tiberius took over. You might remember that Augustus had won the loyalty of Roman soldiers with a combination of things: military victories, largely in civil wars, a powerful propaganda program, and just outright bribery, paying the soldiers money, giving them gifts of land. Now, on the first count, military victories, Tiberius had plenty of those. He had personally led armies, just even in the past couple of years, against German tribes along the Rhine, and he had expanded Roman territory in Western Europe. But on the other two counts, by refusing titles, for example, Tiberius was opening up a debate about exactly what he was officially, and the extent to which he was actually in control of the state. And questions like that undermined the propaganda that so many Roman elites and soldiers and others had chosen to believe in. Augustus had propagated a powerful lie, and for it to work, everybody had to agree to believe in it and to not question it. They had to voluntarily take the blue pill. And by the age of Tiberius, people were years, decades even, into that lie. Everyone wanted to forget that this new system that Augustus set up, what would be called the Pax Romana, was actually built on falsehoods. The chief of these was that a single man with ultimate power was somehow essential to preserving the Republic. That without somebody like Augustus, and now Tiberius, there would just be civil war. And Tiberius, by refusing these titles, was suggesting that he wasn't really like Augustus. And therefore, did the empire really need somebody like that? But if the empire didn't, why did they put Augustus in power and continue to offer him all of these honors and titles and power in the first place? It was cognitive dissonance, not a smart move for Tiberius. And then in the last aspect, outright bribery of the soldiers, the third basis of power I just mentioned, Tiberius faltered here too. Some of the very same legions that Tiberius had led in wars against Germanic tribes openly questioned whether they were going to follow Tiberius now that he was princeps. Around 12 legions in total. That's somewhere between 50,000 and perhaps as many as 70 or 80,000 soldiers. A huge part of the entire military of the Roman Empire mutinied. And this was a major crisis, not only because of the mutiny, but because of where this mutiny took place. Along the Rhine and the Danube, these were hot, contested borders. But the soldiers had rebelled for a purpose. They would return to the fold if the new emperor would simply increase their pay, give them a better retirement bonus, and improve their working conditions. There were two different groups of soldiers that had mutinied, one near the Rhine and the other near the Danube. And so Tiberius had to deal with both of those groups at the same time by sending two sets of emissaries to talk to them. To the Danube group, Tiberius sent a delegation led by two people I want you to remember. One, his natural son, Drusus. Drusus was in his mid-20s, and accompanying him was the Praetorian prefect. That's the head of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own household guard. That Praetorian prefect's name was Sejanus. His name is going to come up several times in the next few episodes. Sejanus was a talented man and an ambitious man, as we will see. So between these two men, Drusus, Tiberius' son, and Sejanus, the head of his bodyguard, a peace was negotiated with the Danubian legions. And that peace was helped by a couple of fortuitous events. A lunar eclipse occurred, and then storms and floods pummeled the land where the soldiers were stationed. These natural phenomena seemed supernatural to the soldiers, who were deeply superstitious and openly wondering whether they had made the right decision to mutiny. It looked to them as though the gods were frowning on their disloyalty, and so they were willing to end the mutiny. Meanwhile, Drusus had the leaders of the mutiny hunted down and executed. So much for that part of the revolt. But there was still the mutiny near the Rhine to deal with. The mutiny in Germany was handled by another person I want you to remember, and that was Tiberius' nephew and adopted son and heir, Germanicus. The soldiers demanded of Germanicus better pay, better work conditions, but they also approached the emperor's heir with an offer. If he would take care of them, they would be personally loyal to him, even if he ordered them to march on Rome and make him emperor. Germanicus refused this offer, and the soldiers became even more threatening, and he began to worry about the safety of his family and sent them out of the camp as things looked to be getting violent. But we're told by sources that the soldiers saw Germanicus' wife and children walking out of camp, and they especially noticed Germanicus' youngest son. And this was a boy that they had played games with and told stories to. He was a friend of the soldiers. He had even developed a nickname, Little Boots, because he had worn his father's military boots while playing with the soldiers. That nickname, Little Boots, in Latin, is Caligula. And young Caligula, walking away from the camp, restored the soldiers' humanity. They weren't really going to murder that little boy, were they? And so the soldiers agreed not to harm Germanicus and his family, and they even delivered up their own officers who had led the mutiny. Many of those were executed for their role in the rebellion. And Germanicus sweetened the deal as well by paying out bonuses to the soldiers out of his own pocket. In the years following those mutinies, Germanicus took over command in the wars against the Germans, and he led those legions to a string of victories which pacified the frontier. Tiberius rewarded his nephew and adopted son with a triumph in Rome, a huge celebration of his accomplishments. And he appointed Germanicus as one of the consuls, and even asked the Senate to grant Germanicus the power to command all other Romans, including all political officials and governors, everybody except Tiberius himself. He essentially made Germanicus a junior emperor at that point. So this man Germanicus was a hero and heir to Tiberius. He was ascending, but at the same time, Tiberius, in the early years after he took power, was floundering back in Rome. The Senate didn't like him. The soldiers didn't like him. He was basically a foreigner in his own city. If you remember last time, Tiberius spent a lot of time outside of Rome. Some of it was off fighting wars, but he also spent years in a self-imposed exile. And in that exile, he was often isolated and alone. And he supposedly developed some strange eccentricities and indulged in perversities. That's at least what the senator Tacitus claims. This is what he says, quote, Tiberius had many symptoms of a cruel temper, though they were repressed, but now and then broke out. And even in the years which, on the pretext of seclusion, he spent in exile in the island of Rhodes, he had no thoughts but of wrath, hypocrisy, and secret sensuality. That's Tacitus in his annals. Some historians wonder if Tiberius, even while recognizing the immense talent and usefulness of his nephew Germanicus, Did Tiberius bear some growing resentment against this young and popular leader? Tiberius, as we'll see, also had a reputation for paranoia, for fear that somebody might come and supplant him. Was he beginning to worry that Germanicus would use his popularity with the soldiers to overthrow his own adopted father and uncle? We don't know if that's the reason, but Tiberius did send Germanicus away from Rome and Germany on a mission to settle disputes in Rome's client kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this got this hero far away from Rome. And then, in 19 AD, while Germanicus was traveling through the Roman province of Syria, he suddenly became ill. And the circumstances here are at least a little odd. The governor of Syria really did not like Germanicus, and Germanicus did not like him. They would trade barbs and insults with each other, even in public. And then Germanicus became sick while he was in that man's province. And we're told that in the room that Germanicus was suffering were found embedded in the walls and underneath the floorboards human remains and curse tablets and other implements associated with dark magic. Germanicus suspected that the governor of Syria was trying to kill him. And so he expelled the governor from his own province. But before he could do anything else, Germanicus took a turn for the worst, and he died in the prime of his life and at the height of his power at age 33. Germanicus's death was shocking to the Roman world. Tiberius was unpopular already, but Germanicus represented the best of the next generation of leaders, hope for the future that Augustus said his new regime would bring about. And some ancient writers think that Tiberius may have even been somehow behind Germanicus's death, that it wasn't a disease that killed the young man, but it was poison. Germanicus died in the east of the empire, and his ashes were brought more than 1,000 miles back to Rome. And as his remains moved from city to city and town to town, crowds of people would gather, publicly mourn, sacrifices would be offered. It seemed like the whole empire was in mourning for this man. Well, the whole empire except for one person. Because when Germanicus's remains were finally interred in Rome, within the mausoleum that Augustus had built for himself and his future family members, there was one man that was conspicuously absent from the ceremony: the Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius's absence in this crucial moment no doubt fueled the feeling that the emperor at least welcomed the death of his own adopted son and may have even had a hand in it. And by the way, Germanicus's death was not ruled an accident when the matter was investigated in the Roman courts. The Syrian governor was brought back to Rome for prosecution, and supposedly he had an impressive piece of evidence to present: a letter from Tiberius ordering the death of Germanicus. But before the governor's trial had finished and that evidence was presented, he inexplicably committed suicide. And his incriminating letter, if it really did exist, we obviously don't have it to this day, it was never found. Hashtag the governor didn't kill himself. Tiberius awarded custody of Germanicus's sons, including the boy Caligula, to his own son, Drusus, who was now the sole heir of the empire. And by 22 AD, Drusus was granted most of the same titles and powers that his imperial father had. And Drusus took on more of the business of the state. And Tiberius seemed to welcome this and use the opportunity to leave Rome and just avoid the business of government altogether. But while Tiberius was away and Drusus was in charge, a third man who had been hiding in plain sight began acting as the emperor's representative. This man was Sejanus, that Praetorian prefect who, with Drusus, had helped quell the mutiny near the Danube. And as head of the Praetorian Guard, Tiberius's own bodyguard, Sejanus controlled the only soldiers with the legal right to bear weapons inside of Rome. He had a monopoly on violence. So even as Tiberius's son Drusus was rising to prominence, Sejanus began accepting some honors as well, and he was offering to speak for the absent Tiberius, delivering messages for the emperor. And Drusus evidently grew a little suspicious. What was Sejanus's game? And it was right that Drusus grew suspicious. Drusus and Sejanus eventually began to fight openly and in public. One of their confrontations even came to blows, and Drusus hit Sejanus in the face. And it was not long after this, we're told, by the Senator Tacitus, that Sejanus decided to go after Drusus in his own home by seducing Drusus's wife. Quote, in the part of a fiery lover, Sejanus seduced Drusus's wife to adultery. Then, when the first infamy had been achieved, and a woman who has parted with her virtue will not refuse other demands, Sejanus moved her to dream of marriage, a partnership in the empire, and the murder of her husband, Drusus. And she, the grandniece of Augustus, the daughter-in-law of Tiberius, the mother of Drusus's children, defiled herself, her ancestry, and her posterity with a market town adulterer. That's Tacitus in his annals. In 23 AD, Drusus was poisoned, just 4 years after Germanicus had died. Was the death of Drusus the culmination of a plot between Tiberius's own prefect Sejanus and Drusus's wife? We can't know for sure, but now Tiberius had no obvious male heir. Both of them had died. The sons of Germanicus were the next logical choice, especially Caligula, but he was still far too young. If Sejanus was aiming at power, this was now his moment to take it. Sejanus asked Tiberius if he could marry the late Drusus's widow, the very woman he supposedly plotted with to murder her own husband. This marriage would put Sejanus officially into the imperial family. But Tiberius refused Sejanus's request, and this was a major setback for the Praetorian prefect. But the death of Drusus affected the fortunes of others as well. Caligula and his brother had been in his care, and now the two children, along with their widowed mother, were without male protection. Caligula's mother became paranoid, worried that someone, perhaps even Sejanus, would try to murder her and her sons. And Tiberius was unwilling to help. In fact, Tiberius did what he had done so often in the past. He left Rome yet again. And this time, the move was permanent. Sailing off to the island of Capri, Tiberius would never set foot in Rome again. He abandoned the city he was supposed to rule. He failed to select a new heir. The Senate was rudderless, and members of his family, women and children even, were left to the mercies of the ambitious and now unopposed Praetorian prefect Sejanus, who was now Tiberius's de facto regent in Rome. But did Sejanus want even more? Perhaps even to supplant Tiberius and become emperor himself? We'll find out on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.